You know, we live in a world of unimaginable potential, when each and every single one of us really have the opportunity to do every single thing that we want. And in doing so, we're capable of influencing so much change. An example of this is Adele. I don't know if you can see through the shade, but Adele in 2015 released a song called Hello. And within 24 hours, she had racked up a grand total of 27.7 million views. And it just goes to show the unimaginable potential and capability that each and every single one of us possess. But it also means that we have an obligation in conjunction with an opportunity to do so much. Good evening, everyone. My name's Friedland, and it's truly an honor to be back in India. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'll be discussing empowering access to education in the age of globalization. But before we begin, I'd like to share with you how it is that we as humanity have arrived at this important juncture in which we are each able to influence so much change. You know, 300,000 years ago, sapiens, early humans, tamed fire. And in doing so, we developed the ability to cook at our will. All of a sudden, we were consuming cooked food, which was broken down by our bodies far more easily and readily than ever before. And as a result, our small and large intestines didn't have to work quite as hard. And over a period of time, they actually shrunk in size by 25%. Now, in shrinking, they consumed less energy, and as a result, our bodies could spend more energy elsewhere. This energy was demanded by our brains, and over the last 300,000 years, our brains have increased in size from 600 to 1200 cubic centimeters. Now, this has brought us into what we call the cognitive revolution, which occurred 70,000 years ago, a time in which this brain growth and development enabled humanity to be exactly where we are today and paved our trajectory. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this is because I equate the taming and discovery of fire 300,000 years ago to the taming and discovery of Wi-Fi and internet in today's day and age. In the same way that 300,000 years ago, we as humanity were capable of vastly influencing and manipulating landscapes by setting them ablaze, or we could decide to use fire for good by cooking and furthering humanity. So too, in this day and age, can we make those types of decisions. We can use internet and Wi-Fi for terribly evil things, such as sending 90,000 hate-filled Twitter messages, much like ISIS do every day. Or we can decide to use it for good by providing education and technology to the most rural, far-reaching corners of the planet. The choice and opportunity truly is ours. Now, today's theme is We the People. And it's interesting. We the People is first found in the Indian context, in the preamble to the 1950s Constitution. However, in today's day and age, if you ask me, We the People represents our globalized community and represents our obligation and opportunity to ensure that each and every single one of us are empowering humanity together and ensuring that we're all moving onwards and upwards together, much like how we see here. Now, let's talk about Adele for one more second. So, she received 27.7 million views in just 24 hours. And in this day and age of this kind of connectivity, how many people do you think lack access to education? In this day and age, when each and every single one of us can go on a place like Khan Academy or YouTube and read and learn a degree, and so frequently do, how many students, how many primary school children do you think lack access to education? 10 million? 20 million? 30 million? What do you think? Anyone? How many people aren't in school, lack access to it? Let's hear one number. Okay, it's pretty good. So today, 60 million primary school children are not in school. And of those, 26.3 million are not in school due to distance as a barrier to education. And this means that these students want to attend school, but they simply lack access. Now, through my work overseas, I've seen the determination that so many have to walk to school, and so many have to access education, with many walking over 5 kilometers to get to school and 5 kilometers back. And if we still have 26.3 million children who lack access, then we collectively need to be doing a much better job coming up with durable and innovative solutions to ensure that these students have access to education. Now, I'd like to take you with me to a place that I first became conscious of access to education. This place is rural Mbale, Uganda, and the man I'm shaking hands with, his name's J.J. Keki. J.J. Keki has a remarkable story. In 2001, J.J. was visiting New York when he witnessed the atrocities of the World Trade Centers. He saw the intolerance and the destruction that religious intolerance could have, and he understood that if an event like this could take place in the US, then it most certainly could occur in his hometown of Uganda. He ended up going back to Uganda, and being a Jewish coffee farmer, he approached his Muslim and Christian coffee farming counterparts, and he explained the need for them to collaborate. They ended up founding Delicious Peace Coffee Cooperative, and in doing so, they've united these previously disparate faiths, and they've truly empowered the economy on a localized level. Now, an amazing teacher told us in Vancouver about what this man was doing and suggested that we go visit him and see his incredible work. So 6 years ago, my family and I traveled to Uganda to visit JJ and see the community. And while I was there, I realized that the same incredible collaboration that JJ had implemented with his farmers and with the schools could be taken one step further. Many of these coffee farming families started sending their children to the same schools, and these interfaith schools grew. And when I saw these schools, we realized that if these schools that were so rural could be connected to schools in Vancouver and elsewhere, we understood that we could empower education in a far greater, more meaningful way. One of the things that really stood out to us was the disparity between the technology that was available to these students and villagers in their homes, the way that they'd use cell phones to pay for things in the grocery store and use cell phones in a variety of ways, yet the lack of technology that existed in the classrooms. And in trying to connect these schools in Uganda to schools in my hometown of Vancouver, I realized that we could have incredibly beautiful learning outcomes that would mutually benefit both students in Vancouver and overseas. Now, while I was in Uganda, something else that really stood out to me was the distance that so many of these students traveled. And while I'm with you today, something that I'm constantly asked and something that constantly bothers or that I constantly question is, what is my motivation to be doing what I'm doing? And it's through thinking back, and it's through many incredible experiences that I was inspired to start this work. Well, you know, while I was in Uganda, I saw the distance that so many students had to journey. This photo was actually taken as Seth overtook me on one of our journeys. It was a 5-kilometer run to school. And I'd journey with them to school, and then we'd get to the classroom, and I'd notice how many of them were still hungry, and they lacked access to nutrition, which is a prerequisite to education. And I'd continue sitting in the back of the classroom, and I'd see how many of the students were just as disengaged as I once had been. And it could have been because they were too hungry, or too tired, or had a learning disability. And they simply lacked access to the education that wasn't really inclusive for them. And then more recently, on a trip to India a few years ago, one of my most memorable memories was seeing how many students, or how many children, would approach my girlfriend and I, and they would run up to us and speak to us in 4 to 5 different languages. They'd speak to us in English, in French, in German, or Italian. And as a student with dyslexia, I've always struggled academically. And let's just say I learned to read a little bit later in life. And I looked at these children with admiration, and I understood that I would never be one of them. Had I grown up in the same socioeconomic class, in the same environment, my family would not have been able to justify that kind of educational expenditure, because it's simply too expensive to pay for a student when you know they're going to fail. And I would have been stuck in what we call the poverty trap. You know, my path through educational success only came later on. And I was incredibly lucky to have a remarkable teacher named Shoshana Burton. And Shoshi taught me that my curriculum could be made more inclusive through something called experiential learning. And experiential learning is what later on impacts what we call meaningful memory, what educators will call meaningful memory. She taught me that I could take principles and concepts that were espoused in one class, let's say mathematics, and apply it to something else like a project. And in doing so, I could really reinforce the learning outcomes. One example of this was that when I was in grade 11, I had the opportunity to join a committee which raised funds for students in Darfur following the genocide. And I was able to take models that I had been taught in math class and to apply them to this committee to ensure that we were most efficiently and effectively raising funds to buy solar cookers for these students. And all of a sudden, the mathematic models that had previously been elusive and I'd struggled with clicked, because there was incentive for me to understand what was being taught. And these are the same principles and concepts that we've applied at the Walking School Bus to ensure that we maximize learning potential and outcomes. So at the Walking School Bus, we work in 3 primary facets. We work in access to education, nutrition, and curriculum. One example of access is that we're actually currently purchasing school buses for students in Uganda. And what that's doing is, in Uganda, it's positively impacting the economy and the people. But in Vancouver, we're able to engage our donor base and people in a far different way. We have a variety of economists who are currently creating rigorous economic models to ensure that our school bus donation is sustainable and can provide the schools with a passive income to ensure the longevity of the school bus. And what it's also done is, for younger students in Vancouver and other places overseas, we're starting to see that it's generating a discussion surrounding the privilege of access to education. And in doing so, many students are actually understanding that they are lucky to be where they are in life and that they can appreciate their education in a slightly different way. Now, in terms of nutrition, one of the things that we're doing is we're creating community-supported agricultural programs. Now, what this means is every partnered school that we have, we give them the opportunity to implement a garden or a farm. And it works in 2 fantastic ways. For starters, it gives the students the opportunity to actually engage in the process of growing crops, as many of them will invariably work in agriculture, but aren't really given the opportunity to learn about agricultural best practice or productivity. And it also provides students with more nutrition and more food in the classroom. And so far, it's been pretty successful. Now, another area that we work is curriculum. And one example of this curriculum is that we have a school in Vancouver, and specifically a grade 11 biology class. And this biology class have been partnered with a grade 12 biology class in Uganda at the Semekungulu High School. And these students have been communicating, and they've come to understand what plants and crops are frequently grown in Uganda and what are used for agriculture. And they've had the opportunity to actually test and develop agricultural best practice in learning what affects plant growth and productivity and what information can be shared. This information is then disseminated to their partnered school in Uganda, who have the opportunity to actually grow the information and not only benefit from growing and learning, but also create a bond and a connection between 2 previously disconnected communities. And it's through these 3 approaches that I believe we're providing a more holistic approach to access to education, in which we're really strengthening the entire process. Now, does anyone here know what this is? Anyone? So this is what we call a lichen. And a lichen is the symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus. Algae and fungus usually grow in completely disparate regions. They grow in different places. But the lichen represents a rare opportunity for these 2 organisms to come together. And in doing so, they're actually made better off than they otherwise would be. And they're able to thrive in an environment that they otherwise would never exist. And this is exactly what we're doing at the Walking School Bus. We're taking these previously disconnected communities and schools, and we're partnering them. And in doing so, we reckon that we're making these students better off. Now, it's through this paradigm shift in education and in the way that so many of us around the world think about education and access to it that we've been able as an organization to grow, and that other organizations around the world are growing, and that countries around the world are improving access to education. And India is a wonderful example. So in 1999, 60.5% of girls in India would complete their primary education. And I've used data on girls as baseline data because we know that boys in India are more likely to attend school. Now, in 2007, 92.5% of girls in India were completing their primary education. And in 2009, India enacted the Right to Education Act, which made primary school attendance mandatory, and have once again truly furthered the way that we access education. But there is still a great deal that we have to do, and there's still a far way to go. And I'd like to invite everyone in this audience and any future viewers to engage in our programs and help us actually empower access to education. And we've got two pretty simple ways that you can do that. The first is by joining our reading program. And what our reading program does is our reading program, much like that symbiosis that I was talking about with the lichen, our reading program offers the opportunity for schools and students to read books that are set coursework, and to read these books aloud and to record them as audiobooks. These books are then shared with a community overseas who have the opportunity to listen and to read it simultaneously. And once they receive it, they have the opportunity to read and record their own book, share it with the attached PDF, and continue the process. So our reading program is pretty simple, and you can just go to our website and join. And it's one of those things that if there's any schools that you think locally or abroad could benefit from this, you're welcome to join it. Another is our Flip Access campaign. And how this works is we're trying to flip the current realities that too many students around the world have to face when accessing education. So it's pretty easy to join. Step one, you take a photo upside down, or you just take a pre-existing photo and you flip it upside down. Step two, you upload that photo to Facebook or Instagram and use a hashtag #FlipAccess. And if you really want to get a movement started, you can tag 3 friends to help. And step 3, you join the movement and you help us flip access to education, one flip at a time. Thank you very much, everyone.